So yesterday in our Zoom meeting, we talked about George Washington and we went over this information and talked about how he set the two-term limit, that he set the example for that for not running for a third term. And I told you that before he stepped down from being president, that he wrote his farewell address that he published and was giving advice to the American people and to the country about what he felt like America needed to do to succeed. This letter was around 27 pages long. He had a lot of things to say, but I boiled it down into three big pieces of advice that he gave to the young United States. So the first thing that he says is excessive partiality for one foreign nation and excessive dislike for another is dangerous policy. So basically he's saying don't play favorites with other countries. Don't pick one country that you're always an ally with and one country that you're always an enemy with. The second part says we may safely trust to temporary alliances for extraordinary emergencies. So here he's also saying don't have entangling alliances. Don't keep alliances with countries unless you need them for an emergency. Alliances should be temporary. Other than that, you don't want to stay tied up in alliances with countries because sometimes countries that you might be allied with do things that you don't like or don't agree with. And so he says don't play favorites with other countries and don't have entangling alliances. The second piece of advice he gives, he says, I have already intimated to you the danger of parties in the state with particular reference to the founding of them on geographical discriminations. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the baneful effects of the spirit of political parties generally. So he is saying that political parties are bad, that political parties, if they are formed, will divide the country. And I think we can see this even this week with the Democratic and Republican presidential debate. We see that politics have the ability to divide the country, and George Washington recognized that. He specifically says the danger of parties when they're based on geographical discriminations. So remember yesterday I told you the Federalists were mainly centered in the northern states and the Anti-Federalists were mainly centered in the southern states. And so what we'll see is as those factions evolve into political parties, that political parties will help to further divide the North and the South, which eventually will lead to the Civil War. And so George Washington's advice is to not have political parties. His third piece of advice is to avoid the accumulation of debt. Now, I am going to show you our current national debt, and you can determine how well that we upheld this advice. If you look right here, this is our current national debt. We're at around $26 trillion, and it continues to increase. We have debt because we spend more money than what the U.S. takes in tax revenue. The three biggest things that we spend money on in this country are number one, Medicare and Medicaid, two, Social Security, and three, our defense budget. And so the U.S. is in debt, and that was one of the things that Washington told us not to do. So as you can see, we didn't do a great job of following George Washington's advice here. But keep in mind these three things. So in 1796, because George Washington was stepping down from being president, we have a presidential election between John Adams, who is going to run as a Federalist. So the Federalists are now a political party, even though Washington just told us not to have those, and Thomas Jefferson, who's running as a Democratic Republican. So the Anti-Federalist group kind of forms their own political party, which will be called the Democratic Republicans. This party, it's not like a mix of Democrats and Republicans today. So this is based on like democracy versus republicanism and different forms of government. It has nothing to do with our current political parties. So they're running against each other. Adams and Jefferson dislike each other very much. And in the election of 1796, the bad thing was the way that elections were set up then is that the loser became vice president. So what happened was you didn't vote for a vice president, you voted for president, and whoever came in second place became the vice president. So John Adams won the election, but Thomas Jefferson, who was his enemy, became the vice president. So you can imagine how awful this would have been in 2016 if Donald Trump, when he won the presidency, if this was still the rule, Hillary Clinton would have become vice president. And while that would have made a great reality TV show, I highly doubt that anything would have gotten done. And neither did anything get done under John Adams' administration. In fact, what happens is this election helps create the first party system where we're going to see a divide between the Federalist Party in the North and the Democratic Republican Party in the South, which again is what George Washington warned about. And this political division will increase throughout the 1800s. It'll further sectionalize the North from the South and eventually lead to the Civil War in 1861. So Adams' administration is pretty hindered on things that they can accomplish because of this setup. But I wanted to point out that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists are the beginnings of political parties in the United States. So the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were both groups or factions that debated the Constitution, but the Federalists will become the Federalist Party. After the War of 1812, which we'll learn about in Unit 4, the Federalist Party dies out and the Whig Party will form to take its place. The Whig Party eventually evolved into the Republican Party, with Abraham Lincoln being the first president that's elected for the Republican Party. But it's very important to note that the Republican Party then is very different than the one today. Abraham Lincoln and Donald Trump are not the same type of Republican. In fact, the parties have switched, and so Abraham Lincoln's Republican Party would actually be more like the Democratic Party of today. If we look at the Anti-Federalist group, they will become the Democratic Republican Party. The Democratic Republican Party eventually evolves into the Democratic Party, but again, this is a different Democratic Party than the one today. The first Democratic president will be Andrew Jackson, but Andrew Jackson's Democratic Party is very different than Joe Biden's Democratic Party today. So even though these are the beginnings of political parties, they are different. The parties will actually switch after World War II. The Republican and Democratic parties kind of switch, which you'll learn about in American history too. But for today, just know how those two become the parties.